d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, c5, knight f3, queen b6, knight c3, bishop d7, d takes c5, queen takes c5, queen d4, queen takes d4, e takes d4, a6, knight e5, e6, bishop e2, bishop b4, short castle, knight c6, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight d1, short castle, f3, knight h5, bishop e3, rook fe8, f4, knight f6, knight f2, bishop f8, a4, rook ec8, bishop d3, bishop d7, g4, knight e8, g5, b5, b3, b takes a4, b takes a4, f5, g takes f6, knight takes f6, rook fb1, a5, h3, h5, bishop d2, bishop d6, king g2, bishop c6, king f3, rook a7, rook b6, knight d7, rook a6, rook takes a6, bishop takes a6, rook b8, bishop d3, bishop b4, c3, bishop d6, rook e1, king f7, f5, e5, bishop b5, bishop takes b5, a, takes b5, rook takes b5, king e2, a4, rook a1, a3, knight d3, e takes d4, c takes d4, rook b3, bishop c1, knight b6, king d2, knight c4 check, king c2, rook b7, bishop f4, bishop e7, bishop c1, king f6, knight f4, king takes f5, knight takes d5, king e4, knight takes e7, rook takes e7, bishop takes a3, knight takes a3 check, rook takes a3, king takes d4, king d2, rook e5, rook a4 check, king d5, h4, king e6, rook f4, g6, king d3, rook a5, king e4, rook a3, king d4, rook g3, king e4, king d6, rook f6 check, king c5, rook f4, king c4, rook f6, king c3, rook d6, rook g4 check, king e3, king c4, king f3, king c5, rook f6, king d5, rook f4, rook g1, rook a4, king c5, rook a5 check, king b4, rook a6, king c3, rook a3 check, king d4, rook a4 check, king c5, rook a6, king d5, rook a5 check, king e6, rook a6 check, king f5, rook a5 check, king f6, rook a6 check, king g7, rook a7 check, king h6, rook a4, rook c1, rook e4, rook c3 check, Rook e3. Rook c2. Rook e4. King g7. Rook f4. Rook c5. King e4. Rook c3. King d4. Rook a3. King e4. Rook b3. King d4. g5. H takes g5. King g6. Rook f8. King takes g5. King e4. King g4. Rook g8 check. King h3. Rook f8. Rook g3. Rook a8. h4. King f4. Rook g2. King f3. King h2. Rook h8. h3. Rook h7. Rook g8. Rook f4. Rook g7. Rook a4. King f2. Rook a2 check. King f1. Rook a1 check. King f2. Rook g1. Rook h7. Rook g4. Rook f7. Rook g6. Rook f8. Rook g2 check. King f1. Rook a2. Rook f7. Rook a1 check. King f2. Rook g1. Rook f8. Rook g4. Rook f7. Rook f4 check. Rook takes f4.